Welcome to the first episode of Learning from Legends. So first I'll just tell you real quickly what this is about, and you can decide if it's something you're interested in going forward. But my idea is to examine games from legendary players and look for key ideas, basic ideas that we as club players can take from their games and try to apply them to our games. So the idea isn't to go over every tactical possibility and get caught up in analyzing positions in depth. It's to kind of zoom out and look for kind of the big picture ideas and then try to apply it in our games. And so what I wanted to do, at least for the foreseeable future, is focus on isolated queen pawn positions. And the reason for that is I'm starting to do a deep dive in isolated queen pawn positions, and I've been trying to play some openings that commonly give rise to IQP positions. And so therefore I want to, kind of look at how the legends played it, see what kind of ideas I can take from them and try to apply them in my own games. So if that's something you're not interested in, I would recommend maybe pausing the notification button or, because that's what I'll be focusing on for the near future. So anyway, we'll get into the first game here, and it actually is a game by Steinitz. And this game was actually against Zukertort in the first ever Chess World Championship, and that took place in the United States in both New York and New Orleans, I believe. So what I'm going to do is just kind of zip forward to the part where we get the isolated queen pawn on the board. It's not so much about openings and specific lines and stuff like this. We're trying to look for kind of big picture ideas. And then I'll kind of discuss too why I chose this game. And maybe I could touch on that real quick here. So I chose this game. It's not one of the most exciting games. Hopefully we'll have a lot of those where we focus on attacking and using the dynamic potential of playing with the isolated queen pawn. But this game is of historical importance because Steinitz came up with a good way of playing against the isolated queen pawn, at least for his time. And this kind of turned people off to playing the isolated queen pawn for some time after this, after Steinitz's time, because they viewed it as a weakness instead of like a dynamic strength. In truth, it's, depends on the position, of course. But, how things go in world championship matches has a big influence on how chess is played, during the time following that. And this game was very influential. And so what I wanted to do is we'll kind of look at the ideas that Steinitz used to defend against this isolated queen pawn. And I guess since this is the first video, I can just mention real briefly, but we, kind of not the point of this. It's not like a treatise on the isolated queen pawn or something, but of course the side with the isolated queen pawn has more space, right? Because they have more control of the center and they have more freedom of movement of their pieces. So the idea is, and we'll examine, how white goes about this in other games, but the idea is to play actively for white and try to focus on attacks or busting through and open up the position, get your pieces in better positions than the opponents, try to open things up and have dynamic opportunities. But this game is going to focus on the defense of the isolated queen pawn. So kind of zip forward here and then point out key ideas as I see them as they come up. So now we start to see, this isn't a move that would be typically played today, but we can see what Steinitz's idea is. He is going to head for this blockading square. So that is one common idea in defending these isolated queen pawn positions, is to concentrate your forces on the square in front of that isolated pawn so that it can't push forward. You kind of control it. And then perhaps, like in this game, he heads straight for that square. And so what's interesting is nowadays you might see a different kind of development to accomplish this, where black will go knight to c6, to b4, and then back to d5. But he accomplishes it in a different way here. And we get to this position. And one thing, I will circle back and touch on this bishop to f4 move and just briefly talk about why perhaps you were more likely nowadays to see bishop to g5. There's kind of a specific reason, and we will actually swing back and look at that at the very end. But we're just going to keep moving forward for now. Because now is the start of this kind of idea that Steinitz is credited with. And it's an idea that he would commonly use to defend against these isolated queen pawn positions. And that is to put his bishop on d7, play rook f to d8, and drop the bishop back to e8. And so, why would he do that? This is kind of like the Steinitz development scheme. Well, what he's trying to do is, as we'll see when we examine games from Legends playing it from the white side of this with the IQP, is that this diagonal occupied by this light squared bishop can be a focal point of activity and attacks for white. So you can imagine scenarios where white sacrifices on f7, king would take back, say, and this bishop might be able to grab it with check, or the queen would grab it with check, with reinforcement behind it. We'll see examples of that as we go forward, I'm sure. But this idea is well, get it to d7, swing the rook on the other side, so you get the rook lined up against that isolated queen pawn, and then use the bishop to provide protection for the king. So that's interesting point. So we've seen two things. We saw like this kind of enhanced blockade where black spends some time to get the queenside knight into the blockading square of d5 so that they can keep this kingside knight where it is to provide protection both to that knight and protection to the king side. So a couple interesting ideas already that we see in this game. Kind of buzz along a little bit. And now we see the next kind of idea in defending these isolated queen pawn positions. And Steinitz played knight takes c3. And this actually transforms the pawn structure. It's no longer an isolated queen pawn. But this is a common means of trying to defend against the isolated queen pawn, is to transform the pawn structure into something else, and at the same time getting a piece off the board. So we will see that Steinitz is good at this. He's good at getting pieces off the board, because if pieces come off the board, then you're getting closer to an endgame. But more importantly, you are diminishing the attacking potential for the side that has this extra space with the isolated queen pawn. So that is another kind of idea that we're seeing here. And one thing I should mention, I did leave this evaluation bar on the side. And the reason I did that is I think it's worth noting these are two very legendary players. Steinitz, major legend, right? And you will notice this bar fluctuate when they're playing this isolated queen pawn position. These positions are very rich, and so even players of this strength, you will see that bar fluctuate. And the reason I think that's important is that as club players, we're not going to be playing probably against players even this strong. Now, grandmasters nowadays have the luxury of having, standing on the shoulders of these legends and knowing all these ideas. But the players that most club players face aren't going to be well versed on all these ideas, especially the nuances. And so it's likely in our games, these evaluation bars will fluctuate a lot as well. And so if we can kind of really understand these ideas, try to put them into use ourselves, I think these IQP positions can really be a good weapon. So that's why I left it on. So Now we see another idea of Steinitz, common defensive idea in the IQP, offering trades of pieces. Every piece that the side with less space gets off the board, that gives us more space to maneuver with our own pieces, and it also diminishes the attacking potential of white's pieces. So Zukertort kind of complied here, and we get into this position where we notice Steinitz was able to get 3 of the 4 minor pieces off the board. And that's one thing in the isolated queen pawn position. It's ideal if you're defending these isolated queen pawns to get the minor pieces off the board. And we'll kind of see why that is in a minute, but you know, that diminishes the attacking power with those pieces. And it also, as we'll see here shortly, it allows these major pieces, the rooks and the queens, to do an assault, kind of a frontal assault on this pawn. Now, I know this pawn isn't technically isolated, right? Because it is this pawn couple that's isolated. But in a sense, it's the same general idea, is that this pawn is not protected by other pawns, and so it is vulnerable to an assault. So that is a common theme in these isolated queen pawn positions, and Steinitz understands this well. He got these minor pieces off the board, and now he is going to hammer on this isolated pawn. White, protects that pawn, and now we have f6. So he's starting to push white back. And what we notice here is that, white, obviously a legend himself, Zukertort, he plays rook to h3. He's trying to play active, hitting on h7 instead of just complying and moving the knight away. And why didn't he want to move the knight away? Well, let's say he plays knight to f3 here. Black has this idea of queen to a6, hitting both those pawns at once. Obviously, this is good for black. So Zukertort's trying to fight more actively. It's kind of not going to be easy. So here we see another idea, kind of focusing in on that, using squares around it that aren't protected by other pawns. If there's a pawn there, obviously this would not be available. So using squares around, in front, and around that isolated pawn island, harassing the pieces that are providing protection. And now we're going to get into kind of a flurry here before too long of kind of some very active play and tactical and very analytical stuff. We're not going to go examine all the possible variations and stuff like that. We'll just kind of quickly go through it because we've kind of gotten our key points that we wanted to cover. But we'll see one more key point here, f5. So this move, this kind of puts a nail in the coffin to any potential attacking play that white may try to get going here at the last minute. And it also, lets this bishop get to a beautiful square. So just a good move, right? And then the weakness of these pawns will show themselves. Oops, sorry. So actually, white played this rook to g6, probably not the best move, but it's a hard position to play, of course. And we'll just kind of quickly go through the rest of this because it gets kind of tactical. But when everything, the smoke settles and everything's said and done, we see this beautiful game, and black resigns basically at this point. What we'll do is I should jump back. I wanted to look at that, why that bishop is sometimes better on g5, especially if against Steinitz's kind of setup here. So let's look at that, and then we'll just highlight real briefly, touch on kind of the key ideas in this game. So let me find that real quickly here. All right, right here was the move where they played bishop to f4. One thing worth looking at real quickly is that, okay, you will more commonly see, and we'll probably definitely cover some games by Botvinnik, when the players start, having a better sense for playing these positions dynamically in an attacking fashion. Now, let's say in this game, if that bishop was put on g5 instead of f4, so that would be like this. Well, now, if Steinitz tried to put his idea of getting the rook here and dancing the bishop down, we can see why that would be problems with that based on the location of that knight. Because like in this position here, if Steinitz tried to go and play bishop to d7 to use the Steinitz setup, providing protection to f6, there's a problem with it. So maybe you want to pause the video, see if you can find it. But that is that, well, white can just start ripping on the d5 square, because in this position here, he can take the knight, remove the defense of that d5 pawn, and now when we get to this position, he's free to just take this pawn. I guess if he wanted to, he could even throw in rook to c5 first, but this pawn would fall. And so that is why this bishop to g5 is much more effective than bishop to f4. So that could be something worth noting as a club player. Maybe if black plays, or if white plays bishop to f4, maybe we can set up the Steinitz maneuver. So I guess in summary, we saw a number of ideas from Steinitz, who, was kind of put people off to playing with the isolated queen pawn because of his effective ways of handling at the time, with the ideas available to the players playing with the isolated queen pawn, is that, okay, he did this this blockade where he used the queenside knight to go to d5 and kept the kingside knight on f6, so this like kind of super clamped down blockade. He exchanged the pieces off to get the games closer to an endgame and reduce the attacking potential for white. He used the weaknesses of the square in front of the isolated queen pawn, so d5 is a way to maneuver pieces around, and he used the squares around the isolated queen pawn. Remember, he got his queen out here, and so he was good at using the squares in front and around the isolated queen pawn. He transformed the pawn structure away from the isolated queen pawn, but in the process created another pawn that was a target, because white still had 3 pawn islands instead of 2. And he fought against the attack. He did that by doing f4 to try to put an end to any attacking stuff that white might have on the queen side, allowing his bishop to get up here to e4 and kind of shut everything down. So really interesting game. Not a lot of like fireworks per se, but a good game historically to be aware of, and kind of be aware of this idea that Steinitz used, that as well as using the queenside knight to get to d5. Like I said, more commonly nowadays you would see a maneuver like this, getting there through the b4 square, and that is why white will often play a3 to kind of shut that down, and kind of justifies that tempo spent on a3 to stop this plan. But yeah, so plan going forward, I want to analyze these games of the Legends, see what we can learn from it. Hopefully, eventually I'll get some of these interesting ideas I'll be able to apply in my own games. Maybe we'll look at them once in a while if I'm able to directly apply some of these ideas that we learned from the Legends. So I hope you enjoyed that. I found it useful. If you do, I'll be making more of these, and I look forward to seeing you. Take care.